It was a dark and stormy night, and the wind was howling through the deserted streets. The only light came from the flickering street lamps, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. She walked quickly, her coat pulled tightly around her, her head down against the driving rain. She had heard the rumors about this neighborhood, about the strange occurrences and the ghostly apparitions that haunted the old houses. But she didn't believe in ghosts, she told herself. It was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But as she turned down the final street, she began to feel a sense of unease creeping over her. The houses here were dilapidated and abandoned, their windows boarded up and their yards overgrown. And then she saw it. The old Victorian mansion at the end of the street, with its turrets and gables and wraparound porch. It was the house they said was haunted. She hesitated, her hand on the gate. But she had come this far, and she wasn't about to turn back now. She pushed the gate open and walked up the pathway, her heart pounding in her chest. The front door was open, and she stepped inside. The house was dark and musty, and she could hear the sound of creaking floorboards and whispering voices. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was growing inside her. This was just an old house, she told herself. There was nothing to be afraid of. She made her way through the front hall, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. And then she saw it. The staircase leading up to the second floor. And at the top of the stairs, the ghostly figure of a woman, her long white dress trailing behind her, her eyes empty and staring. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. This was no trick of the light, no figment of her imagination. This was real. And then the ghost began to move, her arms outstretched, her voice a mournful wail. She turned and ran, her feet pounding on the floor. She could hear the ghost's laughter behind her, cold and mocking. She reached the front door and threw it open, and then she was outside, the rain pouring down on her face. She ran down the street, her lungs burning, her heart racing. She didn't stop until she reached the safety of her own home. And even then, she knew she would never be able to shake off the memory of that ghostly figure and her tragic story.
The old abandoned asylum stood at the edge of town, its crumbling walls and rusted gates a constant reminder of the atrocities that had occurred within its walls. For years, the locals had whispered rumors of ghostly apparitions and terrifying screams coming from the asylum at night. But no one had dared to enter the decrepit building until now. She had always been drawn to the dark and macabre, and the asylum had always been at the top of her list of places to explore. So when she heard that the asylum was going to be demolished, she knew she had to act fast. She gathered her team of paranormal investigators and set out to explore the asylum. They entered through a broken window, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay and neglect, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. As they made their way through the corridors, they began to uncover the horrifying history of the asylum. They found cells with iron bars and straitjackets still hanging from the walls, and the remains of patients who had died alone and forgotten. But the most terrifying discovery was yet to come. As they entered the basement, they were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The walls were covered in blood, and the floor was littered with bones and body parts. They soon realized that they had stumbled upon the secret operating room where the doctors and nurses had performed gruesome experiments on the patients. The team was horrified, and they knew they had to leave. But as they turned to leave, they saw her. The ghost of a young woman, her eyes hollow and haunted, her screams echoing through the corridors. She was one of the patients who had been subjected to the cruel experiments, and her spirit still remained trapped in the asylum. They ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't stop until they had reached the safety of their cars. But the memory of the ghostly apparition and the tragic history of the asylum stayed with them, a constant reminder of the evil that had occurred within its walls. The team couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in their bones after their experience in the asylum. They had uncovered a dark and tragic past, one that they knew they would never be able to forget. As they began to research more about the asylum's history, they found out that the doctors and nurses who had worked there were never held accountable for their actions. They had gotten away with their crimes and were still living their lives, free of any repercussions. This discovery made the team even more determined to make sure that the memory of the asylum and its victims would not be forgotten. They decided to create a documentary about their experience and the history of the asylum in order to bring the truth to light and honor the memory of those who had suffered there. The documentary was a success and helped to raise awareness about the atrocities that had occurred in the asylum. It also helped to bring closure for the team, knowing that they had played a part in ensuring that the victims of the asylum would not be forgotten. The asylum was eventually demolished, and a memorial park was built in its place to honor the memory of those who had suffered there. And even though the asylum was gone, the spirits of the victims would always be remembered. But the story did not end there. As time passed, strange occurrences started happening around the memorial park. People reported seeing ghostly apparitions, hearing screams and cries coming from the park at night. Some even claimed that they had felt a cold hand on their shoulder or heard their name being called out in the dark. The team, who had created the documentary, decided to investigate the park again. They set up cameras and audio equipment around the park, trying to capture any paranormal activity. What they found was beyond their wildest imagination. They captured the ghostly figures of the patients who had suffered in the asylum, still roaming the grounds of the park, as if they were still trapped in the past. They also recorded the screams and cries that people had been hearing, coming from the spirits of the victims who were still reliving their traumatic experiences. The team was devastated by what they had found, but they knew that they had to share the information with the public. They released the footage and audio recordings to the media, and the public was shocked and horrified by what they saw. The memorial park was closed down, and a proper investigation was launched. The remains of the patients who had been buried in the park were exhumed, and they were given a proper burial. A memorial was built with the names of all the victims inscribed on it, so that they would never be forgotten. The team felt a sense of closure, knowing that they had helped to bring the truth to light and honor the memory of the victims. But they also knew that the spirits of the victims would always be present, a reminder of the tragic events that had occurred in the asylum, and a reminder to never forget the past and the atrocities that have been done in the name of science or any other reason.
It was a dark and stormy night, and the only sound that could be heard was the sound of raindrops hitting the roof. John was driving down an old country road, trying to make his way home from a long day at work. The road was deserted, and the only light came from his headlights. Suddenly, his car engine died, and he was left stranded in the middle of nowhere. As John tried to start the car, he heard a strange noise coming from outside. He cautiously opened the door and stepped out into the rain, peering into the darkness. That's when he saw it, a figure in the distance, moving towards him. John tried to run, but his legs felt heavy and slow. The figure got closer, and John could see that it was a man dressed in tattered clothes, with a sinister grin on his face. The man reached out and grabbed John's arm, pulling him close. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a low voice. "This is my territory, and I don't take kindly to intruders." John struggled to free himself, but the man was too strong. The next thing John knew, he was waking up in a dark and damp basement, tied to a chair. The man was standing in front of him, holding a knife. "You see, I've been hunted for years," the man explained. "And now, I hunt those who dare to venture into my territory." John tried to scream for help, but the man clamped a hand over his mouth. "No one will hear you," he said with a chilling laugh. "You're mine now, and I'm going to enjoy making you suffer." As the man advanced on him, John realized that he was trapped, with no escape from the terror that awaited him. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the pain to come. John opened his eyes and saw that he was no longer in the basement. Instead, he was standing in a dense forest, surrounded by tall trees. He looked down and saw that he was holding a map in his hand. He tried to remember how he got there, but his memory was foggy. As he looked at the map, he realized that he was lost and had no idea how to get back to civilization. He started to walk, hoping to find a way out of the forest. But the deeper he went, the more disoriented he became. The trees seemed to close in on him, blocking out the light. That's when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer. John started to run, but the footsteps continued to follow him, no matter how fast he ran. Suddenly, John stumbled and fell to the ground. He looked up and saw the same figure from the basement standing over him, brandishing a knife. "You can't escape me," the figure said with a menacing grin. John tried to get up and run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear. The figure leaned in close, the knife raised high. Just as the knife was about to come down, John woke up, drenched in sweat and trembling with fear. It was all just a nightmare, but the memory of the terror stayed with him long after he woke up. He knew that he would never forget the fear that he felt in that dream. He would never forget the figure that hunted him through the forest, threatening to take his life. It was a beautiful day and a group of friends decided to go on a picnic in the jungle. They packed food, drinks, and games, and set off into the lush, green forest, eager to enjoy a day of fun and relaxation. As they walked deeper into the jungle, they noticed that the trees grew denser and the sunlight grew scarce. Despite the ominous feeling in the air, the friends pushed on, eager to reach a clearing where they could set up their picnic. But soon, strange things began to happen. The friends heard strange noises coming from the forest, and they felt like they were being watched. They tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. As they reached the clearing, they realized that something was off. The clearing was overgrown with vines and weeds, and the atmosphere was creepy and foreboding. Suddenly, they heard a loud growl and they saw a large, shadowy figure moving through the trees. The friends tried to run, but they quickly became lost in the dense jungle. As they searched for a way out, they encountered strange and terrifying creatures lurking in the shadows. They realized that they had stumbled into a place where the laws of nature no longer applied, and they were in grave danger. The friends fought for their lives as they tried to find a way out of the jungle, but the creatures were relentless. They were running out of time, and it seemed like there was no escape. As they approached what they thought was the edge of the jungle, they came face to face with a horrifying figure that threatened to consume them all. The friends had no choice but to fight for their lives, using all of their strength and wit to survive. In the end, only a few of them made it out alive, forever changed by their harrowing experience in the jungle. From that day on, they would never forget the terror that they faced on their picnic in the jungle. As the surviving friends made their way back to civilization, they were haunted by their experience in the jungle. They told their story to anyone who would listen, but no one believed them. The authorities dismissed their claims as hallucinations brought on by stress and fear. But the friends knew the truth. They knew what they had seen and what they had faced. And as time went on, they started to notice that strange things were happening to them. They felt like they were being watched, and they heard strange noises at night. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, and that the terror from the jungle had not let them go. One by one, the friends disappeared, until only one was left. This last surviving friend was consumed by fear and lived the rest of their life in solitude, never daring to venture into the jungle again. Years later, a group of adventurers stumbled upon the clearing where the picnic had taken place. They found strange symbols etched into the trees and felt a sense of dread and foreboding. They quickly realized that they were not alone, and that they were being watched. And as they tried to escape, they too encountered the same horrors that had plagued the friends on their picnic so many years before. The legend of the picnic in the jungle spread, and people whispered about the strange and terrifying things that had happened there. But no one ever dared to venture into the jungle again, for fear of encountering the same horrors that had claimed the lives of so many. And so, the jungle remained, a place where the laws of nature no longer applied, and where the terror of the picnic in the jungle lived on. Decades passed and the legend of the picnic in the jungle was all but forgotten. It was just a scary story that people told around campfires to scare each other. But then, one day, a group of archaeologists stumbled upon the clearing while conducting a survey of the jungle. They were shocked to find evidence of a picnic that had taken place many years ago, and they were intrigued by the strange symbols etched into the trees. The archaeologists decided to investigate further and set up camp in the clearing. But as they began their work, they started to notice strange things happening. They heard strange noises in the middle of the night, and they felt like they were being watched. They tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. And then, one by one, the archaeologists started to disappear. No one knew what had happened to them, and no trace of them was ever found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The families of the missing archaeologists launched a search party, but they too encountered the same horrors that had plagued the friends on their picnic so many years before. They never returned, and their fate remains unknown to this day. The legend of the picnic in the jungle was once again reignited, and people whispered about the strange and terrifying things that had happened there. They said that the jungle was cursed, and that it was a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. And they warned others not to venture into the jungle, for fear of encountering the same horrors that had claimed the lives of so many. But there are those who are drawn to the jungle, who seek to uncover its secrets and unravel the mystery of what happened on that fateful picnic so many years ago. They say that the truth is still out there, waiting to be discovered. But whether they will ever find it, or whether they too will fall victim to the terror of the picnic in the jungle, remains to be seen.
To our valued readers, we hope you enjoyed this story and are eager to see what happens next. We know that waiting for the next installment can be tough, but we promise that it will be worth it. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts or feedback about this story, please let us know. Your support and engagement is what drives us to keep writing, and we look forward to continuing this journey with you. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this thrilling tale, and be sure to keep an eye out for part 2.
The night was dark and stormy, and Sarah was home alone. As she settled in to watch a movie, she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, no one was there. She shrugged it off and returned to the couch. But the knocks continued, louder and more persistent. Sarah's heart raced as she approached the door again, hesitant to open it. But when she did, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. As she stepped back, the figure stepped forward, revealing a grotesque face with piercing red eyes. Sarah screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure lunged towards her, and Sarah tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was trapped, helpless as the figure drew closer and closer and closer. Suddenly, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving Sarah alone and trembling in fear. But as she looked closer, she noticed a small note left behind. "I'll be back."
A family moves into a new home and discovers a dollhouse in the attic. But strange things start happening when they bring it down to the living room. The family's daughter, Lily, becomes obsessed with the dollhouse and spends hours playing with it. But one night, Lily wakes up to find one of the dolls has moved on its own. As the days go on, more and more strange occurrences happen in the house. Doors slam shut, objects move by themselves, and the family hears unexplained whispers in the night. The parents become increasingly worried about their daughter's obsession with the dollhouse and try to get rid of it. But Lily refuses to let it go. One night, the parents wake up to find Lily missing. They search the house and eventually find her in the living room, playing with the dollhouse. But this time, something is different. The dolls are moving on their own and seem to be trying to communicate with Lily. The family realizes that the dollhouse is haunted by the spirits of the doll's former owners, and they must find a way to get rid of it before it's too late. The family decides to do some research on the dollhouse and its history. They learn that it was built by a man named Edgar, who had a reputation for being eccentric and reclusive. He had no family and spent most of his time building miniature furniture and creating dollhouses. The family discovers that the dollhouse in their attic was one of Edgar's earliest creations. It was originally meant to be a gift for his niece, but she died before he could give it to her. After her death, Edgar became obsessed with the dollhouse and spent countless hours making it more elaborate and detailed. As they delve deeper into the history of the dollhouse, the family learns that Edgar's mental state began to deteriorate in the years leading up to his death. He started hearing voices and became convinced that the dolls in his creations were alive. The family realizes that Edgar's obsession with the dollhouse was passed on to Lily, who has been unwittingly communicating with the spirits of the doll's former owners. The family must now find a way to break the connection between Lily and the dollhouse before it's too late. As they search for a solution, the family begins to experience even more paranormal activity in the house. They see apparitions of the doll's former owners and hear their voices whispering in the night. Finally, they come up with a plan to destroy the dollhouse and break the connection between Lily and the spirits. But when they try to carry out their plan, they realize that the spirits are not willing to let go of their beloved dollhouse so easily.
It was a dark and stormy night. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the house. Emily sat alone in her living room, huddled under a blanket with a book in her hand. She tried to ignore the storm outside, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. Emily's heart raced as she got up to answer it. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the door. Standing on her porch was a tall, shadowy figure. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but Emily could sense that it was not human. The figure spoke in a deep, guttural voice. "May I come in?" it asked. Emily was too scared to reply. The figure stepped forward, and Emily stumbled backward. She ran to the kitchen, searching for a weapon. As she rifled through her drawers, she heard the figure's heavy footsteps approaching. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the house into complete darkness. Emily's heart raced as she fumbled for a flashlight. When she finally found it and turned it on, the figure was right in front of her, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. Emily screamed and swung the flashlight at the figure. It recoiled, then lunged forward, knocking Emily to the ground. As the figure loomed over her, Emily realized that she was not going to make it out alive. Just as the figure was about to strike, the power suddenly came back on, flooding the room with light. The figure vanished into thin air, leaving Emily alone and shaking on the ground. She never forgot that terrifying night, and she always made sure to keep her doors and windows locked tight, even on the calmest of nights.
It was a dark and stormy night. The wind howled outside, and rain lashed against the windows of the old, creaky house. Jenna sat alone in the living room, curled up with a book, trying to ignore the eerie noises that echoed through the halls. She had always loved reading horror stories, but tonight, she was living one. Suddenly, Jenna heard a loud knock at the front door. She froze, her heart racing as she listened to the rain battering against the windows. She tried to convince herself it was just a tree branch, but the knocking persisted. Trembling, she slowly made her way to the door and peeked through the peephole. Standing outside was a figure in a long black coat, their face obscured by the shadows. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light. But then she heard a voice, a low, menacing growl that made her blood run cold. "Let me in," the voice demanded. Jenna backed away from the door, her mind racing as she tried to think of what to do. She could call the police, but the phone was upstairs, and she didn't want to take her eyes off the figure outside. As she stood there, frozen with fear, the knocking grew louder, and the voice grew more insistent. "Let me in," it growled again. "I won't ask twice." Jenna knew she had to do something. She made a break for the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest as she heard the figure pounding on the door behind her. She raced up the stairs, stumbling in the darkness as she tried to find her way to the phone. As she reached the top of the stairs, she heard a loud crash from downstairs, and the sound of the front door splintering under the force of the figure's blows. Jenna knew she was running out of time. She fumbled with the phone, trying to dial 911, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold on to the receiver. Suddenly, the line went dead. Jenna tried to redial, but there was no signal. She was trapped, alone, with the figure that was now making its way up the stairs. Jenna backed away, her heart racing as the figure drew closer. She could see it now. Its face twisted into a grotesque snarl, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light. And then, everything went black. When Jenna woke up, she was lying in a hospital bed. Her friends and family were gathered around her, tears in their eyes as they told her what had happened. They had found her unconscious on the floor, covered in bruises and cuts, with no memory of what had happened. But Jenna knew. She could still feel the terror that had gripped her that night, the fear that had chased her through the halls of that old, creaky house. And she knew that the figure she had seen was still out there, waiting for its next victim.
It was a dark and stormy night. The wind howled and the rain pounded against the windows of the old mansion. Emily sat huddled under a blanket, her heart racing as she heard footsteps outside her door. She was alone in the house, or so she thought. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the mansion into complete darkness. Emily fumbled for her phone, hoping to use its flashlight to navigate her way to safety. As she turned on the light, she saw a figure in the corner of her eye. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Her heart pounding, Emily made her way down the hallway, her phone casting an eerie glow on the walls. But as she reached the staircase, she heard a creaking sound coming from below. It was the sound of footsteps. Emily hesitated, unsure if she should go down or stay put. But then she heard a faint whisper. It was a voice she didn't recognize, and it seemed to be coming from the shadows. "Come down here, Emily," the voice beckoned. "I won't hurt you." But Emily knew better than to trust a stranger's words. She turned and ran back down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the end of the hallway, she saw the front door. She could make a break for it. But as she reached out to grab the doorknob, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there. The hand was cold and clammy, and it seemed to be coming from beyond the grave. Emily screamed and ran towards the stairs, hoping to find a way out of the mansion. But as she reached the staircase, she saw a figure standing at the bottom. It was a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Emily froze in terror, her heart racing as the figure started up the stairs. She knew she had to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure drew closer, its eyes glowing brighter and brighter and brighter. And then, just as it was about to reach her, the power flickered back on. The figure disappeared, and Emily found herself standing alone on the staircase. She breathed a sigh of relief, realizing it had all been her imagination. But as she turned to go back to her room, she heard a faint whisper in her ear. "I'll be waiting for you, Emily," the voice said. "And next time, you won't be so lucky."
It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night where the rain was relentless, tapping on the windows like a ghostly visitor begging to be let in. But it wasn't just the rain that was unsettling. There was a feeling of unease in the air, a sense that something wasn't quite right. Maggie sat in her cozy living room, wrapped up in a blanket, reading a book. She tried to ignore the feeling, but it was too strong. She kept looking over her shoulder, feeling like someone was watching her. She chalked it up to her imagination and tried to focus on her book. Suddenly, she heard a loud knock on the door. It made her jump, and her heart raced with fear. She hesitated, unsure of whether to answer it or not, but the knocking persisted, so she reluctantly got up and walked to the door. As she opened it, she was greeted by a man she didn't recognize. He was soaked through from the rain, his clothes sticking to his skin. He looked frantic, and his eyes darted around as if he was being chased. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "Can I come in? I'm being followed." Maggie hesitated, unsure if she should let a stranger into her home, but she couldn't leave him out there in the storm. She let him in, and he collapsed onto her couch, visibly relieved. As she tried to calm him down, she noticed something odd. He had no shoes on, and his feet were covered in mud and dirt. And then she saw it, a trail of muddy footprints leading from her front door to the living room. But she had been alone all night, so who had been walking around her house? She tried to remain calm, but her heart was pounding in her chest. She asked the man what was going on, but he didn't answer. He just sat there looking terrified. That's when she heard it, the sound of someone walking upstairs. She froze, unable to move, as the footsteps grew louder and closer. The man looked up, fear in his eyes. Suddenly the footsteps stopped, and there was silence. Maggie couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She waited, trembling with fear, for what felt like an eternity. And then she heard it, a soft whisper in her ear. "I've been waiting for you." The man screamed, and Maggie ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like someone was holding it shut from the other side. They were trapped. The whisper came again, louder this time. "I've been waiting for you." Maggie turned to the man, but he was gone. In his place was a dark, shadowy figure hovering in the air. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its voice was cold and empty. "You should have never let me in," it said. "Now you'll never leave." Maggie screamed, but there was no one to hear her. They were alone in the darkness, with nothing but the storm outside and the terror inside.